Welcome back once again, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about, the northern colonies, as well as actually the second part of this. We'll be looking still at the colonies as a whole and kind of looking at the overall colonial character. What are some of the reasons why they think what they think? Why do they believe what they believe? And how is that different from their English or British counterparts? But first, we're going to focus on these northern colonies, talking about them in a similar way that we did the South in the previous section, talking about them not, thinking about them as they have moved beyond, the days of, just a handful of people trying to survive in the wilderness, to these are now well-functioning, well-established colonies that have been around for many decades, many generations, maybe even a full century, depending on where and when you're talking about, and how they grow and change as time goes along. Now here, notice that we're talking about them as northern colonies, and that actually means both New England and the middle colonies. So if you say north, you're referring to both your New England colonies and your middle colonies, kind of grouping them together. We're going to group them together like that because they are very similar in some ways, but they are very unique in some ways. So there are going to be times here where we'll distinguish between the two regions there. So make sure you're aware of that, be listening for that, and be learning the difference there. Now, we'll start by talking about the economy in your northern colonies and contrasting that to in the South, what you see there. In the northern colonies, so if you're grouping the middle colonies and the New England colonies together, overall you see a much more diverse commercial economy. Diverse, of course, means there's a lots of variety. There's different things going on there. And that's a big contrast to what we saw in the South. If you recall, in the South, it was based almost entirely on plantation agriculture. And not just that, but even just the number of crops. You could sort of list on one hand the numbers of major crops that were being grown in the South. In the northern colonies, we see lots of different things. It's not just one particular activity. There's agriculture, there is trade, there is businesses, there are all different kinds of businesses and shops, fishing. We're going to look at some of that more specifically in just a moment. But they don't just kind of put all their eggs in one basket as tends to happen in the South. And they're going to be diverse in a lot of different ways. So let's kind of break that down and look at what that diverse commercial economy sort of looks like. In New England, you don't hardly see much agriculture at all, at least not plantation agriculture for sure, or commercial agriculture. The agriculture that's taking place in New England is more what you would call sustenance farming, which means that they're growing crops for sustenance, for food. They do grow crops, but it's mostly, fruits and vegetables and things that are to sustain or to feed their people. They're not exporting that stuff. It's probably just staying very, very local, vegetables, certain fruits, apples, and things like that. But that's not what is bringing in profit for the most part. That's not being exported. It's mostly for sustenance. And the reasons why are probably pretty evident. The soil in New England is just not that fertile. It's much colder. The growing season is a lot shorter. The soil is not as rich. It's rocky. It's difficult to cultivate it. And so agriculture just does not take off there the way that it does in the South. Some of the things that New England, though, is well suited for geographically, even though they're not well suited for agriculture, things like fishing and whaling. Fishing and whaling become major businesses and industries in New England. A lot of natural harbors, and so major commercial fishing and whaling. So not just one person out there on the dock with their fishing pole, but fishing boats and ships. And there are a lot of New Englanders that make their living off of being commercial fishermen. The whaling industry is big for a long time. You probably have learned before about the different things that they used whales for, and so there was a market for a lot of that kind of stuff. Building of ships, shipbuilding is a big thing in New England. Once again, with those natural harbors, a place to build ships and boats that would then be used for fishing or for whatever else. Trade is a big part of the New England economy. This will be true of the middle colonies as well. We talked about mercantilism. We know how big commercial trade and those markets for goods are and how the colonies fit into that. So New England was a place where a lot of big port cities like Boston and places like that will spring up, and a lot of people making money and supporting themselves, making their living off of trade as merchants and things along those lines. Lumber is a big industry in New England. We'll also see that in the middle colonies. One thing that these colonies have a lot of is forest. There's a lot of dense and vast forests, something that England was kind of running out of. And this is, again, illustrating that point about mercantilism, that you needed colonies for the resources, for the raw materials. Timber, lumber, that was a raw material that these colonies were providing. So there's a lot of sawmills in New England where they are processing that lumber. Some of that might be exported. Some of that feeds the shipbuilding industry that we just talked about. So there's a lot of different things going on. Let's take a look at the middle colonies now, New York and Pennsylvania and some of those. You see some of the same things happening there, particularly lumber that we just mentioned in New England. That's also important to the middle colonies. Shipbuilding that we just mentioned with New England, that is also important and happening in the middle colonies. One thing, you have all kinds of businesses and shops. Trade is important in the middle colonies. We know that the middle colonies were founded for the purposes of trade and expansion. So think about big port cities like New York. You know, that is really feeding and fueling a lot of their economy, and that's very important to their economic backbone. One thing that is a little bit different about the middle colonies than New England is that you do see some commercial agriculture in the middle colonies. You don't hardly see commercial agriculture at all in New England, but in the middle there is some large-scale commercial agriculture that's happening. It's not exactly plantations like you see in the South, and they're not growing tobacco and that sort of stuff. The main crop that's grown in the middle colonies for profit is wheat. And the middle colonies become a huge producer of wheat, and that actually becomes a big supplier of wheat to Europe, to England. Their population actually increases in England over the next several decades because of the amount of wheat, as well as other food products that are coming out of those colonies. The importance of exploiting colonies for those natural resources, and you can see that happening here. So once again, much more diverse, lots of different things going on, and that changes society too, because it changes the way that land is distributed, it changes the way that people make a living. It changes lots of things. So we see a much different kind of society in the North as well. So what we're going to do here is look at society in our northern colonies. And here, once again, we are grouping together New England and the middle colonies because this would be rather similar. And I'm going to set this up just like before. Actually, that's going to be on the next slide. In a moment, we'll look at the different groups in society and kind of set it up like a pyramid. Here, we're going to talk about sort of how most people lived and land distribution and how and why that was different, particularly in New England. Now, here we are talking a little bit more about New England than the middle, but this would not necessarily be untrue of the middle colonies either. One thing we definitely see more of in your northern colonies, particularly in New England, is the prevalence of towns and cities. There are far more towns and cities than there are in the South. In the South, most people live in rural areas. There's not really all that many towns and cities to speak of at all. In the northern colonies, you have much more of that. Now, most people do live in rural areas, but they're probably closer to towns and cities than people are in the South. And it is much more likely that people live in towns in the north than in the South. So it's far more what we might call urban. Now, these are not, of course, big bustling cities with skyscrapers and all that kind of stuff just yet. And some of them are quite small towns, but you may sometimes get the image, particularly in New England. This becomes kind of one of the tropes of New England, is this sort of picturesque little town, with the town square and the church and the school and the shops and the stores, and then the houses surrounding that, and then the farmland out there, that whole thing, there's truth to that. And that particularly was true in the New England colonies. And the reason that there's more towns and cities in the New England colonies and really in the northern colonies overall, it has to do with the way that land was distributed and the way that people immigrated. In the South, when they gave out land to people, remember that head right system? They tended to grant land to individuals. Individual people got a head right, got land, and that would become their plantation. In the New England colonies or the northern colonies, land tended to be distributed to groups of people, not just one person, but groups of people, groups of families, whole church congregations even. Remember the importance of religion in settling particularly the New England colonies. So land grants wouldn't be given out to Lord so-and-so, it would go to this whole church congregation. And so instead of that becoming one person's estate, that would become a town. And they, as a people, would then set out and plan their community. They would plan out, okay, here's our land. We're going to put the church here. We're going to put the school over there. We're going to make sure that we've got, farmland here and there and everywhere, all that sort of thing. So because land is given out to groups of people, groups of families, that is the reason why you see more towns and cities there. And the thing about, there's a difference in the way people came to these colonies. In the South, people tend to come as individuals. People would tend to migrate by themselves, looking for their fortune and whatnot. In the New England colonies, because of that emphasis on religion, people migrated as groups. People immigrated as groups. Families came together. Groups of families came together. Whole church congregations came together. And since they were already together, they stay together, and they stay in those groups. And that gives rise to a very important institution in the New England colonies, town meetings. And town meetings are just what they sound like. It's a meeting of the townspeople. It is where, and the meeting house was a very important cultural aspect as well as a physical aspect of your towns, where they would have regular meetings to discuss their problems and come up with solutions and all of that. And they discussed everything from, big momentous things like leadership and how they were going to build a new building and add on to their church and this kind of stuff, to, trivial little things about what are we going to do about farmer so-and-so that's not tying up his livestock and that kind of stuff. And it sounds very simple, and it sounds very mundane, and it sounds very ordinary, and I suppose in a way it is. But the town meetings are incredibly important, and they really do a lot to enhance sort of the character of New England, because the town meetings are a very democratic institution. This is another example of democracy in these colonies, of self-government in these colonies, and in this case, a particularly democratic form of self-government. Now, once again, they're not including everybody, but it is still a very inclusive, by that day's standards, institution. And in many ways, you could argue that the town meetings, many historians might argue that this is one of the most democratic institutions in the colonies, because this is not something like the House of Burgesses, where the really wealthy people are the only ones that even get a say-so on it. This is your regular townsfolk. And while no, they didn't hear the voices of everyone, these were people that, weren't officials elected to public office. These were regular people exerting control over their everyday lives. And that's important. That enhances that character of these colonies. It gives them practice and experience in self-government. It creates that culture in them, that belief in them, that self-government was important, that they had a right to it, that it was necessary. It makes all that feel very, very valuable to them. It just becomes a part of their character. So the town meetings are a very democratic institution of the northern colonies, particularly in New England. Another democratic institution that relates particularly to New England, but this would also really be true not just of Puritans, but also of Quakers for sure. But that is actually in their churches. Now, usually when we think about the Puritans, we probably don't think of them as being very democratic people. We think of them as being very, you got to believe this way, and if you don't, you get kicked out and all that kind of business. But there were actually a lot of aspects about the Puritan faith and Puritan society that actually were quite democratic. Puritan churches were what you call congregational churches, and that is a reference to where the authority lies. In Puritan churches, yes, the ministers held a lot of power, but ultimately the congregation has a lot of power too. Congregations, that's the people in the church, they could dismiss a minister if they didn't like them. They could call a new minister. They ultimately are the ones who get to make the decisions. If they decide we're going to move our church over here or something like that, they can do that. So it's a leadership thing. Whereas in the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, or in the Catholic Church, the authority comes from the top and goes down. In congregational churches like the Puritan church, the authority is really on the bottom and then goes up. So that's really a quite democratic institution, giving a lot of people a lot of control over their everyday lives. You could argue the similar is true of the Quakers that largely settled the middle colonies, because they were quite a democratic people that believed in a lot of egalitarianism. They allowed women to participate in their meetings and things like that. So there's a lot of democratic elements to these people, even though a lot of them start their societies and immigrate for religious reasons. Speaking of immigration, you have a lot more immigration to your northern colonies. So there are a lot higher numbers coming to these colonies, and therefore it is far more diverse. You're going to overwhelmingly have more people of English descent coming to these colonies than anything else, but you do get far more diversity, particularly in those middle colonies. This is where the middle colonies really kind of stick out, because you don't get just English settlement. There's Swedish, and there is Dutch, and there are just different kinds of things, different kind of religions there. And so that leads to a lot more diversity. And before I get to the slavery point, we should point out, particularly with the middle colonies, we pointed this out earlier, their purpose was trade and expansion. They were open to a lot of different people. They were more interested in who wants to be here so that we can prosper economically, rather than let's be restrictive and say we're only going to allow these people or those people or what have you. And these are also very well advertised colonies. They were recruiting people for settlement, and so that's another reason why the immigration is a lot higher. They wanted it to be, and they set these colonies up in such a way that they would be attractive to people. Slavery, as I've already mentioned in the previous section, slavery was absolutely present in these northern colonies. It was legal in all of them, but it certainly wasn't used as much as it was in the South. Certainly probably more in the middle colonies than New England. It's one of those things that probably the more north you go, the less of it you're going to see, but it definitely was there. It's just not as pronounced, and it's not going to be until the American Revolution that we will start to see some of these northern colonies, by that time states, starting to get rid of it. So they are slowly adopting it. In fact, I think I'm wanting to say that it's even Massachusetts, which is a New England colony, may have been the very first one to pass slave codes, specifically specifying people of African descent as slaves and that sort of thing. So they're not exempt from it by any means. Now I want to take a look at the social structure of these northern colonies. Once again, I'm going to set this up here like a pyramid so you can clearly see which groups are on the top versus on, the more working class groups toward the bottom. You can set it up like that in your notes if you like, or you can just write down the groups and some of the characteristics of each one of them. Now, at the top of society in the North would have been a wealthy merchant class. So in the South, you've got that planter elite group. In the North, it's a group of wealthy merchants. These are people that own businesses, that own shops, that make lots of money off of trade. This is an elite class, and it is the wealthiest class, but they're not quite as elite as the planter elite in that, one, it's bigger, and two, there is more sharing of power here between this group of people and people that are maybe not quite as high up as they are. But they do make up quite an elite group, and certainly a lot of your higher offices and people being elected to legislatures and stuff like that likely fall into this, or may likely fall into this wealthy merchant class. Then we have quite a large group of artisans or skilled workers. These are people with a particular craft or a trade. These are people that probably own businesses, skilled workers like a carpenter or a blacksmith or a tailor, or a silversmith or something like that. They have a specific skill that they have trained for, and therefore they're educated. And that was kind of how a lot of the education system worked was, if you were privileged enough, you would be apprenticed to a craftsman, and you would learn that craft, throughout your teenage years and all of that. Probably about half of Northern society, of people or at least men in Northern society, would fit into this group of artisans and skilled workers. But because they have education, they are most likely property owners. They probably own their own business, or their own home. For that reason, they're probably going to be voters. They're probably going to, have more of a position in society. They may not be super wealthy with the big, large estate and all that kind of stuff and tons and tons and tons of money. If you kind of want to look at them as sort of the middle class, then I think that's probably, appropriate. But they do have specific skills, specific education, and are probably landowners. And they, of course, are completely free. Beneath them, you would have a class of unskilled landless laborers. So these are people that do not possess a particular craft or a particular trade, therefore not as educated, and probably don't own their own business. They're not self-employed. These are people who are oftentimes working for these folks. Maybe they're doing manual labor. They might be, on, sanitation kind of work. They might be building and constructing and building roads and building the buildings and all that sort of stuff, or other kind of, manual jobs. But because they don't have specific education, they probably don't make enough money to own their own property or own a business. And so for that reason, since they don't own land, they're probably not able to vote. They're probably not able to participate in a lot of the political activity of the colony. But one thing that you could say for them is that they are legally free. They are not bound to anybody. They are not, owing anything to anybody. So they're free and in control of their life. And there's probably some mobility options there, but they probably don't have as big of a stake in society as either of these two. And then beneath them, you would have a group of indentured servants and slaves, similar to what you have in the South. But obviously, this group would be much smaller in your northern colonies than it is in the South. And we know what both of those things mean. And indentured servitude starts to get phased out eventually here as well. And like I've already said, the number of enslaved Africans is smaller here. But these groups obviously are working for and do not have any kind of legal status. They are not legally free. And in the case of slaves, would have been considered property. So they certainly have no status or position in society, no voice, no power, or anything along those lines. So what we see here is, this always does this, okay, a colonial society that is very unique and very diverse and very rich and very different. Now what we want to do is shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the colonial political mindset, because we have to, I realize there are people here of various descents, but we're going to kind of look at them all as people of English descent. What is it that these people believe about government? What is it that these people believe about politics? There's a particular mindset that they tend to have, just a way they see the world. And in the end, we're going to find that that way that they see the world is quite different than how their English counterparts, how people in the mother country, in the home country, see things. And some of that is a product of them just being British people. And some of that is a product of events that take place in the colonial period. And some of that is a product of just the situation that they are in as colonists. So we're going to go back and talk a little bit about that. So what we're looking at here is this political mindset, what the colonists start to believe about government and power and rights and leadership and all those kind of things, starting with some transplanted English ideas. So we've brought, again, the framework where we're going off of here, we kind of know already that these are people that are going to believe in self-government. These are people that are going to believe in rights. These are people that eventually are going to have a kind of ugly taste in their mouth when it comes to monarchy. They're not totally anti-monarchy yet, but they're going to get there. Some of that is part of their English heritage. So we're first going to start by talking about what is it about their English heritage that they just brought over with them, and so those same English ideas get transplanted and get interwoven into their colonial governments. The first and foremost essential idea there comes from something called the Magna Carta that I'm sure you talked about in world history. This was signed in 1215. That is like 400 years before Jamestown. So this is something that was centuries old by the time that the colonists start making colonies. These ideas ingrained in the Magna Carta would have been deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained in these people for generations. This would not have been a question to them. And the main idea of the Magna Carta was that the king's power was not absolute, that the king was not like a dictator, that the king was the king, and they still believed that the king rules by divine right, but they did not believe that the king had all power. And so that then starts, breeding into these people for a long time the idea that there are limitations on government, that even the king can't do everything, that there are certain rights that even the king has to respect. Now, granted, the Magna Carta was not talking about rights for all people, it was talking about the nobility, but it is kind of a step in that direction. So even when the very first ship comes and settles Jamestown, that's already an idea that people have in these heads. And that's something that really made English people unique among Europeans, was this belief that even the king had limitations on his power. Fast forward now to 1689. This is during the colonial period. Most of the colonies have been established at this point. But in 1689, we get the signing of the English Bill of Rights. This was a product of that English Civil War that they had. Eventually, they restore their monarchy, but sort of the caveat to that was that the monarchy had to agree to this English Bill of Rights. And this spelled out, written down, black and white, the rights of English people, like the right to a trial by jury, the right of, this is where you get stuff about seizing property and searching property and those kinds of things. And if that concept of a Bill of Rights sounds familiar to you, it should, because the United States also has a Bill of Rights. And guess what? It's modeled after the English Bill of Rights. So this is where the colonists later on, or not even that much later, pretty soon, we're going to hear these colonists keep talking about and keep complaining about that their rights are being violated. This violates our rights. This is against our rights. This is illegal. They're not talking about just some rights they think they ought to have. They're talking about rights that they feel are explicitly stated in the English Bill of Rights. And so when they feel like those things are being violated or not respected, they get pretty darn mad about it. So just those ideas as English people, that has sort of taught them that there are even things that governments can't do. There are rights that people have that governments cannot infringe upon them. That's not American, that's English stuff that they brought with them. And then they have further built upon those ideas with all of that democratic tradition in the colonies that we've been talking about off and on for a while. We've talked about how they have become accustomed from the very beginning of governing themselves, how they have, been electing their own legislatures, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, and other colonies do that too. By the time of the Revolution, they all have elected legislatures. They are electing for themselves at least one part of their government, making their own laws. The town meetings are an example of that. The Mayflower Compact is an example of that. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is an example of that. And just the whole concept of salutary neglect, the fact that they have for a long time governed themselves, gotten used to Britain not really having a whole lot of say-so in their everyday lives. That, built on top of their English tradition, has made these a people that are very deeply ingrained in the concept of rights, and that are very deeply ingrained in the concept of, government has to be spelled out. It can only do certain things, and that's it. And then, in addition to all of that, so they've been bringing over new ideas as colonists. They have been building on those traditions. And then we have events taking place in the colonial period, some of which that are taking place in Europe as well, and some of which that are unique to the colonies, that further build on those ideas and even start to challenge some of those things, creating an entirely different mindset. So these are things that are going to continue to lay the groundwork for not just the way the colonists think, but also what's going to lay the groundwork for the American Revolution. We want to say, it had to do with, it was taxes and all that stuff. Well, it was, but this is the reason why they got mad about the taxes to begin with, because they believed it violated their rights and so forth and so on. So let's talk about some of these new colonial ideas that are going to start influencing the colonists and causing them to further question and causing them to further believe in the concept of rights. And this is also where we start to get into the anti-monarchy stuff, when they will start to question and start to feel like monarchy is not the best kind of government and not the kind of government that they might want. So the big event that starts some of this is a big movement called the Enlightenment. I'm sure you studied this in world history. And you'd remember that the Enlightenment, this was an intellectual movement that was spreading throughout Europe. It's really a European movement. Your great Enlightenment thinkers were Europeans, English, French, things like that. But those ideas would inspire a lot of colonists. It affects them because a lot of colonists would read about and become, intrigued by some of these new ideas. The thing about the Enlightenment, the themes of the Enlightenment, they were emphasizing logic and reason over religion. They were demanding and seeking rational explanations, scientific explanations that could be proven, that could be seen. They want data, all that stuff, rather than just a religious explanation or church explanation as to why something happens. And the Enlightenment involves lots of different disciplines, but we're going to talk about how it related to politics, the new ideas about government coming out of the Enlightenment, people questioning old ideas, saying maybe that's not the best way to think about it, and demanding what they saw as a more reasonable explanation for things, and believing in the power of human reason and that people had the ability to use reason to solve problems and so forth. So the Enlightenment involves lots of things. Now, we're going to look at 3 Enlightenment thinkers. We need to know these 3 Enlightenment thinkers that had particular ideas about government and politics, and we need to know what those ideas were and how they reflect ideas of the Enlightenment. So the first one is an English philosopher called John Locke. And I expect you've heard of all these people. You probably looked at them in world history, so maybe this is just kind of a refresher for you. So John Locke, an English philosopher, he comes up with and argues for this theory that he calls natural rights. And he says that natural rights are those rights that just exist in nature. They're just there. They are not given to you by anyone. A government doesn't give them to you. A king most certainly does not give them to you. And therefore, they cannot be taken away. He says these are just inherent in nature, and all people have them. And since governments didn't give them to you, they can't be taken away. These are rights that every government has to respect. And he specifically calls out what the natural rights as life, liberty, and property. That probably sounds familiar to you. The right to live, the right to be free, and then property. That's where John Locke was really rattling some cages because, in Europe, there was the old idea that only the rich, the aristocracy could have property. By him saying that anybody could have property, that was a pretty revolutionary thing. You probably recognize the life, liberty, and property, but you may have heard it as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's because later we will talk about how Thomas Jefferson took Locke, and next one we're going to talk about, and quotes them almost word for word in the Declaration of Independence. So the ideas of these Enlightenment thinkers become some of the very ideas that the United States government is eventually going to be based on. So that's why so much of this is so important. It not only inspires the revolution, but it inspires the United States government. The next of these Enlightenment thinkers is a French thinker called Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and his idea is what is known as the social contract theory. And this one really, really illustrates the overall concept that the Enlightenment is kind of based on. So let me talk about the theory and then I'll go over that. So social contract theory, Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues that government is a contract. It's an agreement. It's an agreement between the governed, the people, and the people who are doing the governing. So when we make a government, we are making an agreement with the people that we're putting in charge. And we as the people, we are agreeing that we're going to obey the law. We will do what that government says, so forth. And then the government must uphold our rights and must protect us. And he kind of alludes to these natural rights there. So it's an agreement. We agree we're going to obey the law. The government's going to protect us and protect our property and all those sorts of things. And then the other part of it is this. This is quite important, and oftentimes people leave this part off. He argues that if the government fails, if the government does not do what it's supposed to do, if they don't uphold people's rights, if they start infringing upon people's rights, taking away those rights, then people have the right to overthrow the government. They don't uphold the contract becomes null and void, is what he's saying. Essentially, what Rousseau is arguing here is that people have a right to revolution, that there are certain cases in which people would be justified in overthrowing their government. That was a complete and totally new idea. It is also here we go with the Enlightenment rejecting religious explanations and wanting more rational explanations. What they're doing here, what he's doing here, is he's rejecting the whole divine right of kings theory that had been the basis of European governments for centuries. He's saying government's power doesn't come from a king that gets it from God. The power comes from the people. The people are what give the government its right to rule, not God. That it is the people's voice that does that. That was quite a revolutionary thing as well. If you recognize that idea about governments have to protect people's rights, if they don't, we can overthrow them. You probably heard it in the Declaration of Independence, because once again, Thomas Jefferson is eventually going to use almost those exact same words and that exact same idea to justify the American Revolution. So we will see that again. Lastly, for the Enlightenment, we're going to talk about another French philosopher, Montesquieu, and his theory was called separation of powers. This one is not so much an influence on the Revolution, but it influenced a lot of colonial governments and then eventually the United States government. And it kind of influences the revolution as well. Separation of powers, he argued that government power needed to be separated amongst three branches, that no one person or no one group of people should have all of those powers concentrated in one place, that was dangerous, that would make a bad government. And he says that those kinds of power are executive power, legislative power, and judicial power. And so that's where we get that concept of three branches of government. And a lot of colonies set their governments up that way, with three distinctive branches, and eventually the United States sets up, and our government is like that now. That is based off of Montesquieu's separation of powers theory. But that further causes the colonists to sometimes question monarchy, because they would argue that in a monarchy, you're putting too much power in the hands of one person, because all of these sort of suggest that concentrated power is dangerous, and that governments with too much power will inevitably abuse it and that sort of thing. So the Enlightenment is further causing people to question traditional authority, to seek more rights for themselves, to appreciate the notion that a government's power should come from the people, and it tends to have a lot of anti-monarchy kind of resonance to it. At the same time that the Enlightenment is saying those things, and that those ideas are spreading throughout Europe, there's another movement that's spreading throughout the colonies that's saying something kind of completely different, but it also has some similarities, and it kind of helps people arrive at a similar conclusion. So at the same time, throughout the 1700s, there's a movement taking place in the American colonies called the Great Awakening. And sometimes you'll see this called the First Great Awakening, because there is a second one that will happen in the 19th century. But this Great Awakening, or First Great Awakening, this is a religious revival, okay? A religious revival, a big religious movement that spreads throughout the colonies, starting in New England, and eventually spreads through all of them over several decades. It probably lasts from about the 1720s to about the 1760s. It's not something that happens overnight. This takes place over several decades, but it's a massive religious reawakening, re-emphasizing religion, people getting re-energized and recommitted to religion, just this big awakening, just as the name suggests. Well, we may ask ourselves, well, why in the world do we need, or are we going to have a religious awakening? The colonies have always been religious, and they have. That's very, very true. But what had been going on in the decades prior to the Great Awakening that concerned some people is there had been kind of a decline in the religious, the word I have right there, fervor, that means like zeal, excitement, and that had been in seeming decline. Whereas, when the New England colonies were first established, they were like totally theocratic, and church attendance was mandatory, and it was real strict. They've had to move away from that. As time went on, they just got away from a lot of that. They have gotten more lax in who can get church membership, and church membership was in decline, and those kind of things. As these colonies have grown, they've had to relax some of those things. And that concerns some people. Some people began to say, we have fallen too far away from our Puritan ancestors. We have betrayed what they wanted us to do. We have gone too far in the other direction. And this is also partially a reaction to the Enlightenment, because you have the Enlightenment going on that's questioning a lot of religious authority and questioning a lot of religious teachings. I don't think I would call the Enlightenment necessarily an anti-religious movement, but some of it kind of can be. a lot of your Enlightenment thinkers rejected a lot of religious teachings, various stuff like that, and so a lot of people were concerned about that and felt we needed to get back sort of to the roots, religious roots, as it were. So this starts in New England, as I said, and then just kind of spreads out. Some of the big figures of the Great Awakening, these two individuals, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, they are both very prominent Great Awakening ministers, some of them credited with sort of starting the Great Awakening and kind of energizing people. And they're also both, or at least one of them, is what you would call an itinerant preacher, which means they move around. They're not just preaching to one congregation. They're like going on tour. And they're becoming almost like celebrities, if that was such a thing in these days, going around to other towns all over the colonies, preaching, bringing more people into the fold, trying to reach as many people as they can. That was kind of part of their mission, was to energize as many followers as they could, get as many people as they could to convert, that sort of thing. And so their style and their message starts to influence people all over the colonies. Speaking of that style and that message, we want to talk about, and it's important to know, some of the characteristics of those Great Awakening sermons, because while they were emphasizing we got to get back to where we were, they were saying some stuff that was very different, and they were saying things in a very different kind of way. They were not preaching the same kind of puritanical message that you had back in the 1620s. Great Awakening sermons, for one thing, they emphasize faith. They emphasize overall faith, not rules. Puritans were so concerned with rules, and you had to do this, and you had to do that, and you had to believe this, and that sort of thing. Both George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards were saying, don't worry so much about the rules. It's not about the doctrine. It's about being faithful. It's about doing good things. It's about repentance, all that kind of stuff. Emphasizing that anybody could have a relationship with God and that everyone should. Emphasizing that it was faith that made you wealthy. It was faith that made you worthy of salvation, not money, not your status, all that kind of stuff, which is kind of what the Puritans had said beforehand. They are de-emphasizing predestination. A lot of them rejecting predestination again and saying it's not predetermined. It's not for just some people. It is for everyone. Don't worry about the rules. Don't worry about what this person tells you to do. Don't worry about what that person tells you to do. It's not about who's right and who's wrong with doctrine. It is about overall faith and doing good things, and having that faith and that personal relationship. So they are saying some very different things. And also the style is quite different. This is not the stand in the pulpit and talk really monotone kind of thing that you had. This is the shouting, emotional, beaten on the pulpit, fire and brimstone, using people's emotions to get them kind of whipped up into a frenzy, reminding people of the power of God, warning them of the dangers of hell, that only God can save them, all this sort of stuff. People wailing and shouting and falling in the floor, the kind of stuff you never would have seen in Puritan churches in the 1600s. But it is a much more vibrant, a much more emotional, a much more charismatic kind of a thing that's going on in the Great Awakening. So let's talk about the effects of that, and there are plenty. Obviously, this has effects on the religious makeup of the colonies. Obviously, it increases church membership. Church membership increases dramatically as a result of the First Great Awakening. We have a lot more churches. A lot more churches are established, particularly out in those more frontiersy kind of areas that may not have been as built up as other places. We also have, and particularly certain denominations grow more than others. Baptists, Methodists, those groups in particular experience a great deal of growth in the First Great Awakening because those are religious traditions that relied less on doctrine, that were not about, believing a specific thing. Baptists, for example, completely non-creedal. There is no creed. There's no set thing. And that was very appealing to a lot of people, particularly, in the frontiersy kind of areas and all of that. There is far more freedom of religion as a result of the Great Awakening, which seems backwards. You would think, if they're emphasizing religion, that means there's less religious freedom, but it's not, because this creates so much more religious diversity that you had to be more free, you had to be more tolerant, because there's just so many more different ideas out there now. Colonies have to loosen up on some of their religious doctrines and things, religious restrictions, that sort of stuff. There are more schools and colleges. This affects education in the colonies. Some of the first schools and colleges in America were established as a result of the Great Awakening. Mostly what are like your really elite Ivy League schools like Harvard and Yale and places like that, because they started originally as seminaries, as places to train people for ministry so they could preserve their particular denominational beliefs and that kind of thing. More missionary work as a result of the Great Awakening. But overall, and here's where, and it's not even just equality, I'll expand on this. Here's where it's similar to the Enlightenment. Even though one is a religious movement and one is trying to de-emphasize religion, they both kind of arrive at some similar conclusions. There's a message of equality in both of these, because in the Great Awakening, one of the big themes was anybody can be saved. Salvation is not for certain people. Salvation is not just for the people that are rich. Salvation is not just for the people that have a particular job in the church. Anybody can be saved. All are equal in the eyes of God. And so that is later equated. That's a message that, it's not about class and everybody's kind of equal. That's not quite the same thing as saying all men are created equal. No, but it is similar. The other thing that both of these movements do, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, they are both challenging traditional authority. They are both in some way saying, forget what you've been taught. Don't listen to them. Listen to yourself. They're both emphasizing individuality. They're both emphasizing individual belief, individual importance, that sort of thing. That it's not about what someone else tells you, it's about what you believe, and that individual people had the ability to make decisions for themselves. So for that reason, it enhances this mindset of equality and anti-monarchy and all that kind of stuff that the revolution is ultimately going to be based on. It's a personality thing. So overall, to wrap up, and this is kind of just reiterating some points we've already made, just some overall aspects of colonial character, things that were true of the American colonies that made them a little bit different. And again, this is kind of rehashing stuff we've already talked about. One is self-government. We have a strong, strong, strong presence and a strong, strong, strong commitment to self-government, to making their own laws, electing their own leaders, and not allowing England, resisting any kind of attempt by England or Britain to govern them and to tell them what to do. Two, a very high degree of religious tolerance. Even though most colonies still have established churches, there are a few that don't, but there is still a very high degree of religious tolerance. No forced religion. A lot of religious variety. That's why there's never been, as the United States, is why we don't have official religion, because there were just too many to try to do that. So there's a very high degree of religious tolerance and resistance to any kind of religious authority in these colonies. No hereditary aristocracy. If you recall, in England, you have your landed class and those titles and all that stuff that's handed down and inherited, and those are the people with the power. You don't have that in the colonies. And so that is something that colonists don't really understand, don't think is important, actually kind of stick their nose up at. And there is, again, more of a sense of equality because of that amongst the colonists. There's far more social mobility in the colonies than there is in England. That's not true of everyone, certainly not enslaved people and that sort of thing. But there is more ability for someone to, pull themselves up from poverty and into a bit of a higher station. That's definitely easier in this colonial society. So once again, we overall have a people who are deeply committed to the idea of rights, that although they are proud English people, they're very different, and they think differently, and they see the world differently. And later we will see those differences cause a lot of big disagreements. So that's what we'll be looking at next.